Welcome to Beyond the Box, where leaders come to build resilience individually and together and embrace radical possibility in their organizations, industries, and beyond. I'm Tamara Kellam, an organizational development consultant passionate about building group resilience and driving systemic transformation. In the first episode of this podcast, I mentioned that embracing radical possibility involves discovering solutions to today's unprecedented challenges by questioning and deconstructing the way we currently see ourselves, each other, and the world. But it occurred to me that I should flesh out what that really means, so the term radical possibility doesn't become a meaningless catchphrase. For it to be meaningful, it should be relatable, anchored in something we can all connect to. So with that in mind, as I share what radical possibility means to me, I invite you to take a moment to think about what it means to you too, how you've seen it expressed in your own life or among your loved ones or colleagues. When I think about embracing radical possibility in my own life, I think about my willingness to keep imagining and exploring potential solutions, even when it feels like there's absolutely nothing left to do or try. It's my willingness to keep hoping, even when I'm at the edge of despair. And this is why I feel that radical possibility is so closely tied to resilience, because being able to tough it out, to endure and persist despite setbacks, isn't just about grit and endurance. It's also about commitment to your desired end, keeping your vision front and center despite how chaotic the journey gets. So that's what we'll be talking about today. How do you remain committed to your vision when you've hit a dead end or multiple dead ends? But before we get started, some of you might be wondering if relentless persistence is always advisable. If not, when is it okay to rest? How do we know when to change course? And when should we stop trying altogether? Too often, the concept of grit is emphasized in conversations about resilience. And these important questions are sidestepped or addressed superficially because they touch on the softer side of resilience. I think grit and grace are both important facets of resilience. And I talk about the dynamic interplay between the two in my Beyond the Box newsletter, which you can view and subscribe to on LinkedIn. I'll definitely be addressing these questions in an upcoming episode, so make sure you subscribe to the podcast and be on the lookout for that. Now, on to today's topic, remaining committed to your vision despite setbacks. There are moments when we find ourselves struggling to see the progress we think we should be making. But oftentimes, even when it seems like we have every right to quit, we're giving up too soon. Sometimes we think we've done all that we can, but there's usually something we haven't been willing to try, something we've written off as unrealistic, taboo, or even silly. Other times, there are solutions we haven't considered because we don't have the mental or intellectual scaffolding, knowledge, assumptions, or perspectives that would allow us to spot opportunities someone else might recognize immediately. In other words, we're held back by our default thinking patterns, unable to see beyond the limits of our mind. As a result, we often find ourselves in situations where we don't know what we don't know. And so we don't know what questions we're not asking that might lead to the very answers we're seeking. And that can be really frustrating. We might fall into the trap of consuming more information, but more data isn't always the answer. How we frame or look at our problems matters almost as much as the knowledge we have about them. This is why I often remind myself, if I think I've done everything I can to change something about the situation, but it still hasn't improved, then I actually haven't tried everything in the literal sense. I either dismissed an idea as too radical, or my way of looking at the situation is keeping me from accessing an idea that might be right under my nose. What's even more interesting to me, however, is the possibility that the solution we're looking for doesn't exist at all. It lies somewhere in the future. And this, I think, is where the essence of radical possibility truly lives. In the realm of solutions we're not supposed to find, but create, what some call emergent solutions. This is where having and sticking to a vision becomes even more critical. Because when we're solving what Ron Heifetz and his colleagues refer to as technical challenges in their book, The Practice of Adaptive Leadership, easily defined challenges with predetermined solutions, the vision statement is simply a tool to keep us focused on the task at hand. There's reassurance that the solution is at hand. All we need to do is keep going and we'll get there eventually. But it's not so simple when we're dancing in the realm of emergent solutions. solutions we can't define because the scope of the problem keeps changing. Crafting and committing to a vision for an outcome under these circumstances is another story altogether. And yet, it's the situation we all find ourselves in today as leaders. And if not as leaders, then certainly as parents, partners, and citizens. The topic of vision is widely talked about in leadership circles. In particular, there's a lot of advice on how to craft a vision statement, who should be involved in its development, and how to make it compelling and inclusive. That works in a stable context where there's continuity, such as when we're dealing with technical challenges. But crafting a vision in an era characterized by constant discontinuity is a different ballgame. Think about it this way. A vision is an image. An image tells a story. The basic structure of a good story is that the past, present, and future are integrated in a way that makes sense. There's temporal continuity. But right now, change is happening so quickly that it's difficult to make sense of what's happening in the present moment. This makes it more challenging to set our sights on the future because our tendency is to connect our present to the future with an imaginary line. Think about it this way. We learn to be aware of how the actions we're taking today have the potential to shape our future. For example, making sure I follow my eating plan and don't skip my runs will eventually lead to me reaching my fitness goals. But this kind of predictability is lacking in so many of our industries. It's hard enough just trying to keep up with what's happening right now, let alone focus on the future. You could say we're struggling with temporal exhaustion, a phrase coined by sociologist Elsie Boulding and quoted in Stuart Brand's book, The Clock of the Long Now. He writes, "If one is mentally out of breath all the time from dealing with the present, there's no energy left for imagining the future." Right now, this type of exhaustion is showing up as information overload, decision fatigue, and reactive decision-making as leaders struggle to keep up with an ever-changing landscape in their industries. It's also difficult to craft and commit to a strong vision amidst increased complexity, making it harder to distill the signal from the noise. And our hopes and fears add to that noise. So how do we manage to commit to a compelling vision, one that inspires and motivates our staff, communities, congregants, or whomever we find ourselves leading, despite ongoing turbulence? The answer lies in our willingness to be wrong, not just about what we envision, but also about the scale, the journey, and the timing of the vision. The truth is, we're struggling because we're trying to get it right instead of building our capacity to handle being wrong. This is what resilient leadership looks like in this new era. Catherine Schultz's book, Being Wrong, Misadventures in the Margin of Error, offers a fascinating exploration of our cultural, religious, and philosophical views of wrongness. We tend to associate being wrong with morality, sin, darkness, or with intellectual inferiority. We are all predisposed to making mistakes. Being wrong is a fundamental part of growth and learning. It's through feedback and error monitoring mechanisms in the brain that we adapt and evolve as a species. So in her book, Schultz describes another kind of error that works as a great analogy for vision, the mirage. Most people know the classic mirage, someone in the desert seeing a cactus or oasis that isn't there. And many of us have experienced it while driving on a hot day when we see what looks like shimmering pools of water on the road in front of us. These are called inferior mirages. It's when we see something that isn't there. But there's another type, the superior mirage. It's more common in polar regions where a temperature inversion occurs. Normally, the higher you go, the colder it gets. But near the poles, the higher you go, the warmer it becomes. This temperature inversion changes how light bends downward instead of upward. So because of this, you might see a real object like a mountain range or a ship off in the distance, off in the horizon, but it will appear much closer or larger than it actually is. It might even look like it's floating in the sky. Its size, scale, and distance are all distorted by the limits of our visual system and by the environment itself, and the way that the environment is acting or interacting with our visual system. So crafting a vision as a leader works the same way, whether we're seeing something that doesn't yet exist but could, or something real that's farther away than we think. Our insight is being shaped and sometimes distorted by our environment. Sargat and McGrath, in their HBR article, Learning to Live with Complexity, write that the goal isn't to minimize risk entirely, but to minimize the costs associated with risk, because mistakes will happen. Many of us fail to commit to an outcome or abandon our visions altogether because we misjudged our capabilities or overestimated our resources. Despite how common and human these errors are, we tend to frame them as moral failings or intellectual flaws. And that framing keeps us from pursuing ideas in the realm of radical possibility, not because they're impossible, but because we can't pin them down with precision. We want templates and certainty, and unfortunately, the pace of change may be asking us to get more comfortable with flexibility and abstractions, and essentially with getting some aspects of our vision wrong, such as in the case of a superior Mirage, where we're seeing something, but its size or scale or distance is distorted in some way because of the way our perception is being influenced by our environment. So when the size, scope, or timing of our vision turns out differently than expected, the temptation is to abandon it, to doubt our insight, and just leave the path altogether. But this is where remembered leaders set themselves apart. If you can keep imagining and exploring potential solutions, even when it feels like there's nothing left to try, now you're operating in the zone of radical possibility, where resilience meets success. So as we close, I'll take us back to where we started. Earlier, I asked you to think about what radical possibility means to you. Hopefully, you've had a chance to reflect on that. My invitation is this. Think about where a fear of being wrong might be keeping you from leaning into an area you've been struggling to transform. Whether in your personal life or in your professional role, ask yourself, how might giving yourself permission to make mistakes free you up to think more creatively about the situation? Until next time, take care.